Welcome to Part 6 of The Wine Merchant. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 16. A good night's sleep restored Trammell, and the next morning he realized that his seething anger had diminished. He could now reflect calmly on the failure of his plans. As he revisited the specifics of the watch he had maintained, he became increasingly convinced that his perimeters hadn't been breached. He was confident that no one could have slipped past unnoticed between the depot and the distillery. Yet, despite this certainty, the shipment had been delivered. Archer and Benson weren't trying to mislead him. They had no idea they were overheard and had no reason to speak anything but the truth. So how was the communication being made? He couldn't shake the feeling that if these people could devise a plan, he should be able to figure it out too. He refused to accept that his mind was inferior to anyone else. Lighting his pipe, he took slow, thoughtful drags as he pondered the question, and then a potential answer struck him. What if there was an underground connection? Had these men dug a tunnel? This seemed like a plausible idea. Digging 300 yards of tunnel wide enough for a crouching man would be easy for the skilled conspirators he faced. The soil was light and sandy, allowing them to use as much framing as they needed without raising suspicion. True, they would have to pass beneath the railway, but timbering could handle that. He imagined their biggest challenge would be dealing with the excess earth. He started calculating the implications. The tunnel would need to be at least 4 feet by 5 feet for lining, which would mean about 2 cubic yards of dirt per yard of tunnel, roughly 600 to 700 cubic yards in total. Could this have been hidden in the filling of the wharf? He believed it could. The wharf was an imposing structure, measuring at least 30 yards by 30 and standing 8 or 9 feet high. It would have taken more than 2,000 cubic yards of fill to construct it. Disposing of the earth wouldn't have posed any challenge. Everything excavated from the tunnel could have easily filled the wharf 3 times over. Since a tunnel seemed like a feasible idea, he shifted his focus to the next challenge. How could he determine whether it had actually been built? Clearly, the answer lay in inspecting one end or the other. If it existed, it would have to link to the cellars of the depot and the distillery. There was no doubt about where he should begin his search. The depot was not only smaller and more manageable, but it was also unoccupied at times. If he failed to find anything at the syndicate's premises, he would stand little chance at the larger building. It was true that he had already searched it without success, but since he hadn't been specifically looking for a cellar then, he felt that with a clearer purpose this time, he might have better luck. He decided that if Benson was heading to Hull that evening, he would take another shot at it. He caught an afternoon train to Selden, and making his way back toward the depot, concealed himself in the same spot he had used before. There, sheltered by a hedge, he awaited the manager's arrival. The weather, from the inspector's perspective, had taken a turn for the worse. The sunny days were behind them, and the sky was thick with clouds. A cold wind gusted in from the southeast, carrying a damp fog that threatened to rain down at any moment, flecking the leaden waters of the estuary with spots of white. Trammell shivered and pulled his collar up around his ears as he huddled behind the damp bushes. "Damn it," he thought. "Once I get into that shed, I'll be leaving puddles all over the floor." Still, he kept his watch, and soon enough he was rewarded when he spotted Benson appear at the door in the fence. After locking it behind him, Benson headed down the railway towards Selden. As before, Trammell waited until the manager was well out of sight. Then, after quickly crossing the tracks, he produced his bent wire, opened the door, and 5 minutes later found himself back in the office. It was clear that if there was an entrance to the cellar, it would be concealed. He needed to search for hidden doors or movable panels. He began by checking the thickness of the walls, taking note of the room sizes to deduce measurements for those he couldn't measure directly. He discovered that no wall was more than 6 inches thick, which meant there couldn't be any hidden openings. This narrowed his options. The only possible exit from the building would be a trapdoor in the floor. Determined, he set to work in the office, crawling along the floorboards with his flashlight, examining the seams between them for any signs of dust accumulation, testing for loose boards, but to no avail. The board stretched across the floor in one solid piece, firmly nailed down to the underlying joists. He moved to the bedroom, rolling aside the mats that covered the floor, shuffling the furniture back and forth. However, he had no better luck there. The rest of the shed had a concrete floor, and a quick but thorough inspection showed that the surface was unbroken. Nothing on the wharf itself, or in the area behind the shed, offered any hint of a hidden staircase. Feeling deeply frustrated, Trammell made his way back to the office. Once seated, he ran through everything he had done, trying to think of any spot in the entire depot he might have missed. The only place that came to mind was the space beneath a large wardrobe in the next room, which he hadn't moved due to its obvious weight. "I suppose I should check," he muttered to himself, although he doubted such a heavy piece of furniture could slide back and forth without leaving marks on the floor. He made his way back to the bedroom. The wardrobe was divided into two sections, a single deep drawer at the bottom and a sizable cupboard above it with a central door. He grasped one end of the wardrobe. It was incredibly heavy. In fact, he realized he couldn't budge it at all. He picked up his flashlight and examined the wooden base. To his surprise, he discovered it was firmly nailed to the floor. Perplexed, he tried to open the door. It was locked, and although he eventually managed to slide back the bolt with his wire, the difficulty he faced made it clear that this was a high-quality lock. In fact, it wasn't just a simple cupboard lock screwed to the inside of the door as he had anticipated. It was a small mortise lock hidden within the thickness of the wood, with a keyhole on the inside, just like those found on internal house doors. Inside the wardrobe, he found nothing of interest. 2 coats, a couple of waistcoats, a sweater, and some other clothing hung from hooks at the back. Apart from that, the space was empty. Why, he wondered, staring into the wardrobe, would anyone feel the need to lock up clothes like these? His gaze drifted to the drawer below. Grabbing the handles, he yanked with frustration. The drawer was clearly locked. Once again, he retrieved his wire, but for the first time, it let him down. He shone the beam from his lamp into the hole, and that's when he understood the truth. The hole was a ruse. It went into the wood but didn't go all the way through. It was not connected to any lock. He directed the light around the edges of the drawer. If there was no lock to secure it, why had he been unable to open it? He pulled out his penknife and attempted to slide the blade into the gap. It wouldn't go in, and he realized there was no gap at all, just a cut half an inch deep in the wood. There was no drawer. What appeared to be a drawer was simply a false panel. Inspector Trammell's interest piqued further. He couldn't understand why such space would be wasted, especially since it was evident from the way the wardrobe had been constructed that cost-saving wasn't the reason. Once more, he opened the door of the upper compartment, leaned inside, and swept the lamp over the floor. This time, he let out a small snort of triumph. The floor didn't fit snugly against the sides. There was a gap of about 1/8 of an inch all around. "The trapdoor at last," he muttered, as he began searching for a hidden spring. Finally, as he pressed down on one end of the floor, it sank while the other end rose, revealing a dark square from which a rush of cold, damp air escaped. He could hear the distinctive echo of splashing and churning from the sea below. His torch illuminated a set of stairs, spiraling down into the darkness. After thoroughly inspecting the pivoted floor to ensure there was no secret latch that could trap him below, he stepped onto the ladder and began his descent. Then he recalled the importance of the mortise lock on the wardrobe door. He paused, closed the door behind him, and secured it with his wire. He descended further, allowing the floor above him to settle quietly into place, leaving no sign of his passage. At last, he reached the ground and began to sweep his flashlight around to take in his surroundings. He found himself in a cellar with a ceiling so low that he could only stand upright directly beneath the stairs. The space was square, about 12 feet on each side, and it opened into 2 dark passages. One appeared to lead down under the wharf, while the other sloped down at right angles, seemingly toward the distillery. Along the center of this second passage, a narrow tramway ran, about 1 foot wide, on which 3 kegs stood on 4-wheeled carts. Each keg was fitted with a tap on its bottom and a dish on top. 2 insulated wires hung down through the ceiling just below the cupboard where the telephone was installed, making their way down the tunnel toward the distillery. The walls and ceiling of both the cellar and the passages were supported by timber props, stained by moisture and marked with dripping earthy water that had seeped from the cracks. They shone with dampness, yet the air, though chilly and moist, felt fresh. The distant sound of waves echoed along the passage beneath the wharf, hinting at an open connection to the river. The cellar itself was nearly empty, save for a large wooden cask that nearly touched the ceiling and a brass hand pump. Pipes extended from the pump. One led to the cask and the other along the passage under the wharf. On the side of the cask, there was a vertical glass tube fitted with a wooden frame, evidently a gauge, accompanied by a scale labeled gallons, which ranged from 0 at the bottom to 2,000 at the top. A dark liquid inside the tube indicated a measurement of 1,250 gallons. There was a wooden spigot set into the side of the cask at floor level, with a tramline running beneath it for the wheeled kegs to roll under and be filled. The inspector gazed at it, his expression filled with almost childlike wonder. "Good heavens," he murmured, "could it really be brandy?" He leaned down to smell the wooden tap, and any lingering doubt instantly vanished. Letting out a colorful curse, he realized the truth of the situation. It was indeed unfortunate. Here he had been hoping to pull off a forgery that would have made his reputation, only to discover this was a matter for the customs department after all. While he would certainly receive a decent reward for his discovery, and he had already managed to solve a murder case, forgery was where his true skills lay, leaving him feeling robbed of his chance to shine. Yet, considering how far he had come, he thought it best to gather as much information as he could. The more thorough the case he presented, the bigger the reward. Plus, his own curiosity was deeply piqued. With the cellar empty except for the cask, a pump, and the small tramway with its trucks, he turned on his light and slowly walked down the passage where the pipe stretched out. He felt certain he was moving under the wharf, heading towards the river. About 60 feet past the pump, the passage floor ended abruptly, plunging down sharply to the churning waters of the river 6 feet below. Initially, in the dim light, Trammell thought he had reached the front of the wharf, but soon realized he was still in the cellar. The ceiling continued straight ahead for another 20 feet, and the walls, about 5 feet apart, dropped vertically into the water. At the end of the passage was a wall that sloped outward at its base, composed of horizontal pit props separated by gaps of 2 or 3 inches. Trammell quickly realized that these props were likely those positioned behind the inner row of piles, which supported the front of the wharf. Along one side wall, a series of horizontal slats were nailed in place, spaced a foot apart. He wasn't sure what their purpose was, but he noticed they formed a wide ladder that stretched 20 feet, allowing a person to make their way from the passage to the end wall and access the water at any tide level. Above this ladder was an object that initially puzzled the inspector, but as he began to understand its use, it became enlightening. Resting on a couple of brackets secured to the wall was a thin steel pipe covered in thick black cloth, measuring about 16 feet long and an inch in diameter. Inside it ran a light copper pipe that connected to a pump at the other end. The copper pipe had several joints resembling those of a gas fixture and was folded in a concertina style. Stepping onto the ladder, Trammell maneuvered his way to the end of the steel pipe near the wall. The copper pipe extended out and ended in a fitting that resembled half of a union. As he looked closer, the realization struck him. The side of the Girondin would be no more than 10 feet from where he stood. If someone inside the cellar were to push the end of the steel tube through one of the gaps between the horizontal timbers of the wall at night, it could be inserted into a porthole, assuming it was directly opposite. The flexible concertina joints would allow it to reach out, and the cloth covering would muffle any noise if it happened to brush against the ship's side. The union on the copper pipe could then be connected to a container on board, allowing brandy to be pumped from the ship into the cask. And no one outside would be any the wiser. On a dark night, with skilled workers in place, the entire operation could be executed without a trace and in complete silence. Now, Trammell understood the purpose of the unusual design at the front of the wharf. 2 lines of pilings were required to create a deck that concealed the openings between the horizontal beams at the front of the cellar. He marveled at the cleverness of the plan. It was no surprise that Gibbons and Bostick had been stumped. However, if he was to continue his investigation, he could not afford to waste any more time. He made his way back across the side of the cellar, re-entered the passage, and returned to the pump room. Then he turned into another passage and hurried along as fast as he could. The tunnel was barely 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, making his progress quite exhausting. After a gentle curve at the entrance, it ran straight and almost level. It was constructed similarly to the cellar, with longitudinal timber lining supported by vertical beams and lintels spaced about 6 feet apart. After trudging for about 200 yards, the tunnel took a sharp left, heavily timbered for another 30 yards before it swung back to the right. "I bet the railway crosses here," Trammell thought as he struggled around the bends. Sweat trickled down his forehead by the time he reached the end, and he sighed in relief as he finally stood up straight, easing his cramped back. He found himself in another cellar, measuring roughly 6 feet by 12. A tramway ran through it, stopping at the far wall. The place was otherwise deserted, except for a wooden grate or tundish with a hinged lid fixed between the tracks near the entrance. The telephone wires that had traced the tunnel all the way now disappeared into the ceiling. Trammell concluded he must be beneath some part of the distillery, and it took only a moment for him to understand the purpose of what he saw. He imagined the kegs being rolled under the tap of the large tun in the pump room, filled with brandy pumped in from the Girondin. In his mind, he saw Benson pushing his loaded carts through the tunnel, much easier than walking with something to trip over, pausing one by one over the grating to empty their contents. There was no doubt that grating connected to some vat or tun buried even deeper beneath the distillery, where the brandy mixed with the other batches brought there by more legitimate means, which were sold without any records of that surprising increase in volume. Trammell suspected there must be a secret door connecting the room he was in with the distillery, but after searching carefully, he found no sign of any opening and concluded that it didn't exist. So he turned and began to make his way back through the tunnel. The return trip felt even longer and more exhausting than the first, and he paused now and then to kneel down and relieve his aching back. As he moved forward, the booming sound of the waves, which had faded to a soft murmur at the distillery, grew louder and louder. Finally, he reached the pump cellar and was just about to step out of the tunnel when he noticed a flickering light at the top of the ladder. Someone was coming down. Trammell quickly switched off his own light, and for a brief moment he stood frozen, his heart racing as he instinctively reached for his revolver in his pocket. He held his breath as a pair of legs appeared on the ladder, descending step by step. In an instant, he understood what he needed to do. If this was Benson coming to collect supplies, staying in the tunnel meant he would be discovered for sure. But if he could just make it to the passage under the wharf, he might be safe. There was nothing that would draw Benson into it. To cross the cellar, he had to get within 2 feet of the ladder, where the man was halfway down. For a moment it seemed hopeless, but then an unexpected opportunity arose. The man paused to lock the wardrobe door. By the time he finished, Trammell was already across the cellar and hurrying down the other passage. Luckily, the noise of the waves drowned out everything else. When the stranger reached the bottom of the ladder, Trammell had already stepped onto the cross laths and was descending carefully. In no time, he was below the passage level. If the man came near, he planned to hide beneath the water, hoping that in the darkness his head would go unnoticed. But the light remained in the cellar, so Trammell raised himself slightly and cautiously peeked down the passage. To his relief, he began to appreciate what he had thought was bad luck. In the darkness, he watched as Benson executed the very tasks Trammell had imagined. The manager moved the kegs one by one beneath the large barrel, filled them from the tap, and then, placing his lamp on the last one, pushed them down the tunnel toward the distillery. Inspector Trammell waited until he felt certain Benson was out of sight, before leaving his hiding spot and quietly making his way back to the pump room. The gauge now read 1,125 gallons, and he noted that 125 gallons were being dispatched with each trip. He swiftly climbed the steps, exited through the wardrobe, and returned to the bedroom. A few minutes later, he found himself back out on the railway. He had checked his watch inside and saw it was just after 10. Benson must have caught an earlier train than usual. The inspector felt grateful that things had unfolded as they did, though he wouldn't have feared for his safety if spotted. An early discovery could have allowed the other members of the gang to slip away. With the last train to Hull gone, he set off on foot for the 6-mile trek to the city. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, and a fierce wind whipped around him, filling the air with a chaotic roar while driving blinding sheets of rain into his face. Within moments, he was drenched, and the gusts made it difficult to move forward. Yet he pressed on, too pleased with the success of his evening's work to let the discomfort get to him. As he reflected on events the next morning, his satisfaction only grew. He had truly done well. Not only had he achieved his goal of uncovering Slatton's murderer, but he had also exposed one of the largest smuggling operations of recent times. True, he hadn't followed through to bring the syndicate to justice. That wasn't his responsibility. Smuggling fell outside Scotland Yard's purview. It was a matter for the Customs Department. If only it had involved forged notes. He sighed at the thought of the acclaim he might have received. But since he had come this far, he figured he might as well ensure the brandy was indeed being offloaded as he suspected. He estimated that the Girondin would arrive in Selden the next day, and he resolved to oversee the operation himself. He took Gibbons and Bostick's plan and rented a boat in Hull, gently paddling down towards the wharf as twilight descended. He had kept an eye on the river throughout the day without spotting the motor ship making its way upstream, but now he saw her passing a couple of miles above the city. He steered closer to the shore to avoid being recognized by Captain Beamish's binoculars. He rowed steadily, calculating his arrival at the wharf would coincide with the onset of darkness. The evening was dry, but the southeast wind still blew cold and biting, though not nearly as strongly as it had during his previous walk. A couple of lights gleamed on the Girondin, and he navigated by these until the dark shape of her stern rose out of the shadows, blocking his view. Just as Gibbons had maneuvered in the River Lesk, he slipped around her back, unshipped his oars, and guided the boat by hand into the V-shaped gap between the 2 rows of piles lining the wharf. As he gently floated forward, he felt his way between the horizontal supports that prevented the filling from falling until he reached an open space. Realizing he was directly opposite the cellar, he carefully pulled the boat back a few feet, tied her up, and settled down to wait. Although the hull offered some protection from the wind, it was still cold and damp beneath the wharf. The waves lapped against the wooden supports, causing the boat to bob restlessly at the end of her short painter. The darkness was complete, an inky blackness with no glimmer of light to be seen. Trammell understood that the waiting would soon start to feel tedious. However, not long after, action began. He estimated he had been there for about 2 hours when he noticed, not 10 feet away, a dim circle of light suddenly appear on the Girondin's side. Someone had turned on a soft light in a cabin, its open porthole directly across from the cellar. Watching with bated breath, Trammell saw what he believed was a steel pipe edge into the illuminated ring. It remained there, protruding into the porthole for about 40 minutes before it was silently pulled back. The porthole was closed, a curtain was drawn across it, and the light inside was turned up. The brandy had been unloaded. The task had been completed without a sound, unnoticed by anyone on either the wharf or the ship. Once again impressed by the effectiveness and stealth of the plan, Trammell gently pushed his boat out from the piles and rowed back down the river to Hull. He secured the boat and made his way back to the hotel, where he quickly fell into a deep sleep. Despite his excitement over his discovery, he couldn't shake the feeling that a lot more work lay ahead. He had figured out how the syndicate was making its money, but he still needed proof of its members' involvement in Slatton's murder. Besides Archer, who else could be mixed up in this? There were, of course, Beamish, Buller, Benson, and Henry. And then there was Morton, whose role in all this remained unclear. Trammell knew he had to locate and identify him, but were those all the players? He suspected there were more involved. It struck him that the smuggling operation likely needed a wider network than just those he had named. He now understood how the brandy was transferred from the ship to the distillery, and he assumed it was loaded at the clearing in a similar manner, transported there somehow by the motor lorries. However, 2 critical parts of the scheme remained a mystery. First, where did the brandy originally come from? And second, how was it distributed from the distillery? Trammell realized both tasks would probably require additional accomplices, and if that was the case, these individuals might also be connected to Slatton's death. He pondered the situation for 3 solid hours before coming to a conclusion. By the end of that time, he decided to head back to London and, pending his chief's approval, present all the findings to the customs departments of both England and France, asking them to carry out an investigation in their respective jurisdictions. In the meantime, he would focus on unraveling the web of complicity in the murder. He departed Hull on an afternoon train, arriving in London that night. Chapter 17. Trammell's superior at the yard was certainly impressed by his subordinate's account. He praised the inspector for his discovery, commended him for his patience in not taking action against Archer until he had identified his accomplices, and approved his plans for advancing the case. Bolstered by this unexpected approval, Trammell promptly made his way to the Customs Department headquarters to meet with Gibbons. The two were already familiar with each other. Earlier, Trammell had visited Gibbons's office and gathered all the information he could from him regarding the case. However, due to prudence, they had not met since that time. Gibbons was extremely excited by the inspector's news and eagerly set up the meeting with his superior, which Trammell requested. The distinguished man was available, and in just a few minutes, Trammell and Gibbons were ushered into his office. "Sir," Trammell began after the necessary introductions, "we are here to present to you a rather remarkable story. Mr. Gibbons would have likely shared his part with you by now, had I not specifically asked him to wait. The time has come to lay out the facts for you. Since Mr. Gibbons's account precedes mine chronologically, I believe he should start." Gibbons then began his narration. He spoke of Bostick's story shared at the Rovers Club, his own suspicions of smuggling based on the lack of return cargoes, and his proposal to Bostick. He recounted their trip to France and what they learned at the clearing. Next, he described their visit to Hull, their observations at Selden Wharf, the experiment conducted with Letham's assistance, and finally, what Bostick had revealed about his second trip to Bordeaux. Trammell then took over the narrative, detailing the murder of Slatton, his investigations into it, and the identification of the killer. He concluded by outlining the challenges still facing him and expressed the hope that the chief, in addressing the smuggling conspiracy, would collaborate with him regarding the murder. The listener wore an expression of astonishment throughout much of the inspector's account, which gradually shifted to one of genuine satisfaction by the end. With a graceful nod, he congratulated both men on their accomplishments and expressed his approval of their findings, eagerly offering to collaborate fully with the inspector to resolve the case. The 3 men then delved into the specifics. To Gibbons's deep disappointment, it was decided that, due to his connections with at least 3 members of the gang, he would not be involved in the final moments of the operation. Instead, he had to settle for having a sort of advisory role. For nearly an hour, they deliberated, and when they concluded, it was agreed that Stopford Hunt, one of the Customs Department's most skilled investigators, would head to Hull to address the distribution of the brandy. Meanwhile, Trammell would travel to Paris to engage the French authorities regarding the Bordeaux aspect of the matter before rejoining Hunt in Hull. Stopford Hunt was an unremarkable-looking man in his 40s. He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, with brown hair that was neither light nor dark, and his attire reflected neither wealth nor poverty. His features were simply ordinary. In fact, he was not the kind of person who would attract a second glance, nor would anyone suspect he played a crucial role in any ongoing situation. Yet, those very traits were among his strongest advantages for the job. When he wandered about aimlessly, as was often his habit, he remained unnoticed by those whose actions he quietly observed. Where casual loitering would arouse suspicion in others, he possessed the rare ability to pass time in a seemingly distracted and thoughtful manner. That night, Trammell made his way to Paris, and the following day he recounted his story to the courteous chief of the French excise, M. Max was just as intrigued as his English counterpart, and readily agreed to look into the French side of things. That evening, the inspector set off for London, continuing on to Hull the next morning. He found Hunt to be a sharp and competent individual, as well as an engaging and enjoyable companion. They had secured a private sitting room at their hotel, and after dinner they retreated there to strategize their approach. "I wish," Trammell began after a few moments of discussion, "you could explain how this liquor distribution works. It's outside my usual area, and I'm a bit unclear on the specifics. If I understood better, I might be able to assist you more effectively." Hunt nodded and took a slow puff from his pipe. "The basic idea is quite straightforward, though it does get a bit complicated in practice. The key point to remember is that we're dealing with rectifiers, not distillers. Though most people refer to both operations as distilling, they are quite different. Distillers actually create the spirit in their facilities, while rectifiers do not. Rectifiers import the spirit made by distillers and then refine or prepare it for various purposes. Because of this distinction, the checks required by the excise authorities differ for each. For rectifiers, we only need to measure what goes in and what comes out of the facility. If everything is in order, those two numbers should match up when you account for variations during processing." Trammell nodded in understanding, and Hunt continued. "The crux of any fraud lies in the situation where more product leaves the facility than what is reported. In other words, this means that product is being sold without the necessary duty being paid. In a rectifying house, where there are no illegal stills in operation, more also comes in than is reported. In this case, you've already shown how the extra brandy is entering the picture. Our task is to discover how it all leaves the facility." "That much is clear enough," Trammell replied with a grin. "But brandy smuggling isn't anything new. Surely there are established methods to dodge the law." "Indeed there are. However, to navigate those methods, you must first grasp how the output is quantified. For every shipment that departs from the distillery, a permit or certificate is issued to the carrier in charge of transporting it. This serves as a waybill, and a copy is kept for the surveying officer's review. It notes the amount of liquor, the date and time it leaves, the consignee's name, and other relevant details, granting the carrier legal possession of the liquor. An excise officer can stop and inspect any cart, wagon, or railway car transporting alcohol, and the driver or representative must produce their certificate for verification against the load. All surprise inspections, along with the signature of the inspecting officer, are recorded on the back of the certificate. When the shipment arrives, this certificate is handed over to the consignee, who signs it upon receipt. At that point, it becomes their proof for having the liquor on their premises, which they must keep available for the excise officer's inspection. Are you following me so far?" "Absolutely. The deception lies in moving more liquor away from the distillery than what is indicated on the certificates, and I must admit, it's no easy feat. The most common tactic involves filling the barrels or containers just a bit fuller than what the certificate states. Sometimes, this is done simply by adding extra liquor to the regular barrels. There's a belief that an excise officer can't visually detect a difference of 5 or 6%. For instance, 26 gallons may be shipped under a certificate for 25 without anyone noticing much. There are variations of this approach, such as using slightly larger kegs, or more cunningly, opting for regular-sized kegs with the ends thinned down. This allows them to hold more liquid while appearing to show the same measurement with a dipping rod. However, all these methods carry significant risks. Should there be any suspicion that the contents of the kegs are being measured, the deception could easily be uncovered." Trammell, intrigued, leaned forward eagerly as his companion, after pausing to relight his pipe, continued speaking. "Another common tactic is to secretly distribute liquor without any permit at all. This can happen at night, or the liquor can be transported through an underground pipe, or concealed within seemingly innocent items like suitcases or petrol tins. From the operator's perspective, the pipe is the most effective method, allowing one to remain unnoticed for months, but the initial setup is often quite challenging. A third method applies only to rectifiers, highlighting one key difference between rectifiers and distillers. Every permit for taking liquor from a distillery must be granted by the local excise surveyor, while rectifiers have the authority to issue their own certificates. This opens the door to the possibility of creating forged or fraudulent certificates. However, it's not as simple as it seems. The certificates come in books of 200, provided by the excise authorities, and must be kept available for inspection by the supervisor. Any certificates can be compared with the originals kept on file. Handling forged permits is incredibly risky, since all genuine ones carry the government watermark, which is difficult to replicate. In truth, regarding the entire issue of liquor distribution, the chances of successful fraud are so slim that those who attempt it must simply strive to avoid drawing any suspicion. Once suspicion is raised, discovery often follows as a natural consequence. "That's encouraging for us," Trammell replied with a smile. "Yes," the other man concurred, "though I suspect this case will be more challenging than most. There's another point to consider that I haven't mentioned yet, how the perpetrators of the fraud are planning to get their hands on the money. Ultimately, it must come from the public through the counters of the licensed establishments selling the smuggled spirits. But just as the illicit liquor cannot be recorded in the accounts of the establishments selling it, neither can the money they receive for it be logged. This implies that someone in a position of authority at each licensed establishment must be involved. It also suggests, though only hints at, the possibility that the establishments in question are tied houses. The director of a distillery would have more influence over the manager of their own tied houses than over an outsider. Trammell nodded in acknowledgement, but remained silent, so Hunt continued. It turns out that the Ackroyd and Holt Group owns several large licensed establishments in Hull, and I believe we should focus our attention there first. How do you plan to start? I think our first step should be to determine how the Selden liquor is delivered to those houses. By the way, you likely know some of this already. You kept an eye on the distillery during working hours, didn't you? The inspector confirmed that he had. Did you happen to see any lorries? There were plenty of them, large blue trucks. I noticed them heading to and from Hull loaded with barrels. Hunt smiled, clearly satisfied. That's a good start. Our next step must be to ensure that all these lorries have the proper certificates. We should get moving on this tomorrow. Trammell wasn't entirely sure how they would go about it, but he held back his questions, agreeing to follow Hunt's plans. Their plans included leaving the hotel by taxi at 6 o'clock the next morning. The light was still dim as they sped down the Selden road, but the sky was clear, and everything suggested a beautiful day ahead. They got off their horses at the end of the lane leading to the factory and set off across the fields, eventually taking cover behind the same thick hedge where Trammell had previously kept watch. They stayed hidden there for the whole day and the next two, and by the end of that time, they had a complete record of all the lorries that entered and left the establishment. No vehicles appeared except for blue lorries, and Hunt felt confident that if the smuggled brandy wasn't transported by them, it must be sent by rail or at night. We can address those other possibilities later if we need to, he said. But from what I've seen, I think we should focus on the lorries. They supply the tied houses in Hull, which seems like the obvious destination for the brandy. Plus, railway transport is too closely monitored to attract the gang. Let's pursue the lorry angle first and see where it leads. Will you compare the certificates with the list I made? Trammell asked. Of course, that will show if all the vehicles have the proper certificates, but I don't want to dive into that yet. Before raising any alarms, I want to check the contents of a few lorries. I think we could do that tomorrow. Oh, the next morning, the two detectives hired a taxi again and headed down the Selden road until they spotted a large blue lorry loaded with barrels, sporting the words Ackroyd and Holt Limited, licensed rectifiers, on its side. Once it had rumbled past on its way to the city, Hunt called to the driver and instructed him to follow it. The chase took them into the heart of town, ultimately leading to a street that ran parallel to the Humber dock. There, the big lorry turned into an entryway. The Anchor Bar, Hunt said, his voice filled with satisfaction. We're in luck. It's one of the largest licensed pubs in Hull. He jumped out and chased after the lorry, Trammell right behind him. The vehicle had stopped in a yard behind the grand public house, where more barrels were stacked together than the inspector had ever seen. The smell of various liquors hung heavily in the air. After presenting his credentials, Hunt requested the certificate for the shipment. The driver promptly produced it, which Hunt inspected and found to be in order. He then began to examine the consignment itself, and Trammell couldn't help but admire the speed and thoroughness of his inspection. Hunt tested the variety of liquids, measured their containers, collected samples from each cask, and otherwise ensured he was satisfied with both the quality and the quantity. Finally, after checking the lorry, he expressed his satisfaction, endorsed the certificate, and exchanged a few polite words with the men in charge before the two detectives made their exit. "Well, that's all in order, at least," Hunt remarked as they got back into their taxi. "I suppose we'll just go and do this again." And they did. 3 more times that day, and 4 more times the following day, they followed the lorries from Ackroyd and Holt, each time with the same results. All 8 shipments were examined with meticulous care and matched the descriptions on the accompanying certificates. The certificates themselves appeared genuine, and everything seemed in order as far as Hunt could tell. "It doesn't seem like we're going to get anywhere this way," he said late that second evening, as they sat once again discussing the situation in their private sitting room. "Don't you think our persistence has scared them into being honest?" Trammell asked. "Probably," Hunt replied, "but that wouldn't apply to the first few trips. They couldn't have predicted that we would check those shipments yesterday, and today I imagine they thought their visits were finished, but we've pushed it as far as we can. We need to change our approach." The inspector raised an eyebrow, and Hunt went on. "I think it would be best if I visit the works tomorrow to examine these certificate blocks. But should you come along? Archer has spotted you at that hotel lounge, and he knows what you look like." "I won't go," Trammell decided. "I'll see you when you return." After presenting his credentials, Hunt received a polite welcome at Messrs. Ackroyd and Holt's. Once he completed the usual inspection of their various equipment, he requested certain books. He brought them to a desk, sat down, and began to study the certificate blocks. His first task was to compare the list of outbound lorries he and Trammell had compiled against the blocks for the same period. After a brief investigation, he was convinced that everything appeared to be in order. There was a certificate for every lorry that had passed through, and not only that, but the number of the lorry, the day and hour it left, and the load were all correct based on his checks. It was clear that he had once again hit a dead end, and for the 50th time he found himself wondering, with a mixture of annoyance and admiration, how the fraud was being carried out. He was absently flipping through the leaves of the blocks, staring at the lines of writing as he pondered the issue, when he noticed a slight difference in the ink color of one entry. The shipment was mixed, containing various types of spirits. The lowest entry recorded 3 25-gallon kegs of French brandy. This particular entry was slightly lighter than the others on the page. At first, Hunt dismissed it, thinking the page had been blotted while the ink was still wet, making the later items naturally fainter. But as he examined it more closely, he began to suspect that this explanation didn't quite add up. It was clear that the lower 2 or 3 entries below the brandy gradually faded in color as they descended the page, and Archer's signature at the bottom was no exception. From this, Hunt could see the diminishing ink caused by the use of blotting paper. However, he noted that the brandy entry did not follow this trend. It was the faintest of all, paler even than Archer's name below it. He sat there, staring at the page, softly whistling through his teeth, his brow furrowed in thought as he wondered whether it was reasonable to suggest that the brandy item had been added after the sheet was completed. He couldn't think of another explanation, but he hesitated to draw a firm conclusion based on such subtle evidence. Turning back through the records, he sought other similar occurrences, and as he did, his intrigue deepened. Quite a few pages regarding mixed consignments ended with kegs of French brandy. He examined these entries meticulously. Some appeared standard enough, but others fueled his suspicions. In 3 more instances, the ink was certainly lighter than the rest of the page. In 5 it was darker, and in several others the handwriting looked slightly different. Some were more upright, others slanted either more heavily or more lightly. After reviewing all the relevant entries spanning 3 months, Hunt felt certain that his initial deduction was right. The brandy items had been written down at a different time from the others, which could only mean they were added after the certificate was finalized. With his interest thoroughly piqued, he began analyzing the pertinent records, hoping to uncover some additional pattern that might lead him toward a solution. His focus first turned to the consignees. Ackroyd and Holt clearly supplied a considerable number of licensed establishments, yet only 5 of these appeared on the questionable shipping logs. All 5 were situated in Hull and represented significant businesses. So far, so good, Hunt thought, feeling pleased. If they're not offloading their goods at those 5 places, then I'm a Dutchman. He returned to the logs and examined them again. This time, he made an even more intriguing discovery. Only one truck driver was linked to the transport of the questionable shipments. All the trucks in question had been under the care of a driver named Charles Fox. Hunt recognized the name. Fox had been the driver for 3 of the 8 trucks Hunt himself had inspected. The man had been polite during their encounter, providing the investigator with every assistance he could offer. He hadn't shown any signs of embarrassment. Now it seemed quite possible that this same individual was involved in the deception. Hunt immersed himself once more in his review of the logs, and then he stumbled upon yet another noteworthy detail, which, although initially unclear, felt significant. He noticed that the questionable entries were always paired. Just a few pages before or after each entry, there was another log containing details of a similar shipment, identical in every way except that the brandy line was missing. Hunt found himself puzzled. He was convinced he was tracing the fraud, but how it operated remained a mystery. If he was correct thus far, the logs must have been initially created to mimic each other, and later the brandy entry had been added to one of the pair. But why? He couldn't figure it out. Continuing his examination, another interesting fact soon came to light. Even though shipments departed from the factory at all hours, the first entry in each pair was logged between 4 and 5 o'clock. Moreover, the minutes past 1 and past 4 were always the same for each pair, indicating that the brandy shipment was usually the later of the 2. However, there were times when it coincided with the 1 o'clock run. Hunt sat in his small, quiet office, where he had been left to think uninterrupted, mulling over his dilemma and trying to arrange the facts he had gathered in a way that would reveal their true meaning. From what he could piece together, it appeared that Charles Fox, the driver, took a truck loaded with various liquors into Hull 3 times a day. The first trip was unpredictable. He left any time between 7:30 and 10:30 in the morning and covered the entire city. The other 2 trips were consistent. The first always departed between 1 and 2, and the second at the same number of minutes past 4. Both routes inevitably led to one of the 5 large pubs he had mentioned earlier. Each load was generally the same, except for one, typically the second, which included some extra kegs of brandy. Additionally, it seemed that the note for this extra brandy was always added to the certificate after it had been filled out. Hunt found himself at a loss. That evening, he shared his findings with Trammell, and the 2 men delved into the matter thoroughly but still came up empty-handed. That night, sleep eluded Hunt. He tossed and turned, struggling to find a solution. Deep down, he felt it was close at hand, yet he couldn't seem to grasp it. Just before dawn, a sudden idea struck him, and he lay there, filled with excitement as he wondered if he had finally uncovered the key to the mystery. He replayed the details in his mind, and the more he considered his theory, the more plausible it became. But how could he test it? Daylight had broken by the time he found clarity. At breakfast, he shared his idea with Trammell and asked for his assistance in bringing the plan to life. "You're not a photographer, are you?" he inquired. "Not professionally, but I have dabbled a bit," Trammell replied. "Great, that'll simplify things." They stopped by a photography supply shop where they made a deposit and managed to rent 2 large Kodaks for the day. Armed with these cameras and a set of climbing gear, they drove out along the Selden Road, reaching the works shortly after noon. Once there, they dismissed their taxi. When they were alone, their actions may have seemed odd to anyone unfamiliar with their intentions. A 7-foot wall marked the edge of a large villa's property along one side of the road. Trammell, with his friend's help, climbed over it. Using some loose stones, he crafted a small platform so he could just see over the top. With his camera aimed at the road, he slipped into the shadows behind his makeshift barricade. Hunt felt settled as he buckled on the climbing gear and crossed the road to climb a nearby telegraph pole. He secured his camera to the lower wires, careful to avoid any potential shorts, and focused it to capture the center of the road. Pulling out a pair of pliers, he mimicked the motions of a lineman at work. By the time he finished his preparations, it was nearly 1 o'clock. About half an hour later, a big blue lorry appeared, barreling down the lane. Hunt quickly recognized Fox at the wheel. He signaled his accomplice behind the wall, who stood up to peek over with his camera ready. As the large vehicle turned onto the main road, both men snapped photos from their respective positions. Hunt, swiftly changing the film, captured another shot as the lorry rolled away towards Hull. Once the lorry was out of sight, Hunt climbed down and with some effort scaled the wall to join his colleague. In the cool shade provided by the dense trees, both men reclined and smoked quietly until almost 4 o'clock. After a while, they resumed their positions, and about half an hour later saw the lorry again as it left. Just as before, they captured photographs of it. Once that was done, they walked to Hassel Station and caught the next train to Hull. With a few well-placed tips, they convinced the photographer to develop their films on the spot, and by that evening they had 6 prints in hand. To their delight, the photos turned out exceptionally well. The clarity was remarkable, and each shot captured the entire lorry. As Hunt had hoped, the angle from which they had taken the photos allowed each keg in the load to be clearly visible. They counted them. Each image showed 17. "See," Hunt exclaimed triumphantly. "The same amount of cargo went out on each load. We've got them now, Trammell." The next day, Hunt returned to the Selden works, pretending to continue his routine inspection. However, in just 3 minutes, he found what he was looking for. Grabbing the certificate book, he reviewed the records of the 2 consignments they had photographed, and he felt a surge of laughter welling up inside as he confirmed his suspicions. The 2 certificates were nearly identical, except the second one included an additional note of 4 kegs of French brandy. Hunt counted the barrels. The first certificate listed 13, while the last documented 17. 4 kegs of brandy were smuggled right under our noses yesterday, he thought with satisfaction. What a clever trick. Now, to test the next detail. He concocted an excuse to leave the works, and returned to Hull, where he visited the licensed establishment where the consignment from the previous afternoon had been sent. There, he requested to see the certificates for the 2 trips. Upon reviewing his credentials, they were handed over without protest, and he returned to his hotel with them. "Come on," he called out to Trammell, who was engrossed in a book in the lounge, "and witness the final act of this drama." They retreated to their private room, where Hunt laid the 2 certificates on the table. Both men stared at the documents, and Hunt let out a satisfied grunt. "I was right," he exclaimed joyfully. "Look at this. I can even see it with my naked eye." The 2 certificates were precise copies of their blocks. They were correctly dated, both listed Fox as the driver, and both detailed consignments of liquor, identical, except for the extra 4 kegs of brandy noted on the second. Furthermore, there was no indication that this extra item had been added later. The subtle lightening in ink toward the bottom, caused by the use of blotting paper, suggested that everything had been penned at the same time. The first certificate noted the time as 1:15 p.m., while the second read 4:15 p.m. Hunt eagerly pointed to the 4 on the second document. As Trammell examined it, he noted that the lower strokes appeared fainter than the others. Additionally, the beginning of the horizontal stroke did not quite connect with the first vertical stroke. "Do you see?" Hunt shouted excitedly. "That figure is a forgery. It was originally a 1, and they added the 2 lower strokes to turn it into a 4. This case is closed." Trammell wasn't so convinced. "I'm not so sure about that," he replied carefully. "I don't see enough evidence to be confident. Can you go over it once more?" "To me, it's as clear as day," Hunt insisted impatiently. "Consider this. Archer decides, let's say, to send out 4 kegs or 100 gallons of the smuggled brandy to the Anchor Bar. What does he do? He fills out certificates for 2 consignments, each containing an identical selection of various liquors. The brandy is only listed on 1 certificate. The blocks are exact copies of the certificates, except that neither includes the brandy. He times the 2 blocks for 1:15 and 1:15, but both certificates are marked for 1:15. He hands the certificates to Fox, then sends 100 gallons of brandy, as indicated on one of the certificates, out on the 1 o'clock lorry. Hunt paused, looking at his friend expectantly. When the other didn't respond, he continued, "Do you see how things stand? Archer is in the office with his blocks, correctly filled out regarding the times, but without mention of the brandy. Fox is on the 1 o'clock lorry with 100 gallons of brandy loaded. In his pocket are the 2 certificates, both timed for 1 o'clock, one showing the brandy and the other not." The inspector nodded, as Hunt glanced at him again. "Now, let's say the 1 o'clock lorry reaches its destination without being stopped, and the cargo is unloaded. The manager arranges for the 4 kegs of brandy to simply vanish. He takes the certificate that doesn't mention brandy, signs it, and the deal is done. Everything seems in order, and he has successfully smuggled in the 4 kegs. "Sounds good," Trammell interjected. "On the flip side, let's assume the 1 o'clock lorry is stopped by an excise officer. At this point, Fox presents the other certificate, the one that does show the brandy. Once more, everything appears to be in order, and the excise officer is satisfied. True, this time Fox can't smuggle out his brandy, and duty must be paid on that load, but this rare situation won't concern him as long as his method of deceit remains undiscovered. So far, it seems quite reasonable." "I agree. Now, let's consider the 4 o'clock trip. Fox returns to the works with one of the 2 certificates still in his pocket, and what he carries in his 4 o'clock load depends on which certificate it is. He doesn't attempt any further smuggling that day. If his remaining certificate indicates brandy, it means he has brandy on hand. If not, he leaves it behind. In either scenario, his certificate is valid as long as an excise officer stops him. That is, he must make one small adjustment. He needs to add 2 strokes to the 1 of the hour to turn it into a 4. The simplicity of this adjustment explains why those 2 hours were chosen. Is that clear?" "Completely clear," Trammell replied, "except for how the brandy entry fits into the correct block. Of course, Archer makes that entry as soon as he knows how the first trip has gone. If the brandy was smuggled out during the first trip, it means Fox is holding the brandy certificate for the second trip, and Archer will enter that on his second block. However, if Fox had his first load inspected, Archer will make the entry on the first block." "So basically," Trammell declared, "if Archer wants to smuggle out 100 gallons of brandy, he must also send out another 100 legitimately on the same day. If he can manage to send out a total of 200, then 100 will be free of duty, but regardless, he has to pay on 100. "Exactly, that's how it works. It's a clever scheme. The only vulnerability I see is that an excise officer who stops one of the trips might visit the facility and check the certificate block before Archer has a chance to make the change." Hunt nodded. "I considered that," he said, "and it can be addressed easily. I bet the manager will call Archer as soon as the goods arrive. I am going to look into that now. I'll have a record kept at the central of any conversations with Selden. If Archer doesn't receive a message by a certain time, I bet he assumes the plan has failed for that day and puts the brandy entry on the first block." Over the next 2 days, Hunt confirmed the accuracy of his assumption. At that moment, Trammell concluded that his involvement in the operation in Hull was no longer necessary. For Hunt, however, there remained much to accomplish. He needed to gather direct evidence against each of the managers of the 5 tied houses in question, as well as figure out how and to whom they were distributing the goods. since it was clear that they were receiving more brandy than they could sell over their own counters. Still, he and Trammell both agreed that these 5 men were likely unaware of the larger scheme, each having only a private arrangement with Archer. Yet, Trammell doubted he could find any evidence linking them to Slatton's murder. He believed that the French side of the operation, the initial supply of brandy, was more likely to yield useful information. So, the next morning, he boarded an early train to London to lay the groundwork for his work in France. Chapter 18. Days later, Inspector Trammell found himself once again in the office of M. Max, the head of the French Excise Department in Paris. The Frenchman greeted him politely, though without much warmth. "Ah, monsieur," he said, "you haven't received my letter." "No, I wrote to your department yesterday." "It hadn't arrived when I left, sir," Trammell replied. "But if it's something important, could you share the details with me?" "Of course, monsieur. It's quite simple. I regret to inform you, however, that my department won't be much help to you." "Is that so?" Trammell raised an eyebrow. "Unfortunately, yes. Allow me to explain," M. Max gestured as he spoke. "After your last visit, I sent 2 of my men to Bordeaux. They conducted an examination, but initially they found nothing unusual. When the Girondin arrived, they decided to investigate your theory about the brandy loading. They took a boat to the wharf at night and maneuvered between the rows of piles. They located the spaces between the tree trunks you described. Knowing there must be a cellar behind, they hid nearby. They saw the porthole light up and watched the pipe being inserted, all just as you had mentioned. There's no doubt now that brandy is being secretly loaded at the Lesque." "That seemed likely, sir," Trammell commented. "Ah, it was indeed a clever deduction. I commend you for uncovering it." M. Max gave a slight bow. "Now, to continue. My men wondered how the brandy reached the sawmill. They soon concluded it must be delivered by lorry. They arrived at this conclusion for 2 reasons. First, they found no other means of transport. The lorries were the only vehicles that approached, as nothing came by water, and there couldn't possibly be a tunnel, as there was no exit point. That left only the lorries. Second, they found it suspicious that the drivers frequently changed their numbers. Quite suspicious, wouldn't you agree?" "Absolutely, sir." "Good, so my men kept an eye on the lorries. They received assistance from the police in Bordeaux. They discovered that the firewood trade is just a front," M. Max said with a shrug. "There are 5 companies the trucks deliver to, and of those 5, 4. His gesture conveyed a frustration too profound for words. "To cater to them is merely a ruse, or so my men believe. But the 5th company is Raymond Fils, one of the largest distilleries in Bordeaux. The fact that Raymond Fils is distributing brandy raises our suspicions. Finally, we seem to be making progress." M. Max paused, and Trammell nodded to show his appreciation of the insight. "My men visited Raymond Fils. They investigated everything. They discovered that the law wasn't being violated. Everything was in order. They were satisfied." "But, sir, if these people are smuggling brandy into England," Trammell began, but M. Max cut him off. "Yes, monsieur, I understand your concern. I'm referring to French law. It's different from yours. Here, the duty isn't applied to the amount of spirit distilled. We issue a license to the distiller, allowing him to produce any quantity up to the limit specified on the license. But monsieur, Raymond Fils is, how do you say it? Well within their limits. Am I correct? They are not violating French law." "So, sir, you mean you cannot assist further?" "My dear monsieur, what more can I do? I have done my utmost for you. I've made inquiries. This matter is beyond me. Despite my best intentions to help, what else can be done?" Trammell, realizing he could pursue no further, stood up. "Nothing, sir, except to express my sincere gratitude on behalf of myself and my department for all you have done. I assure you, sir, I completely understand your position, and I greatly appreciate your kindness." M. Max also stood, politely reiterating his regrets, and with mutual compliments, the 2 men parted ways. Trammell had once enjoyed a holiday in Paris and had some familiarity with the city. He walked through the vibrant streets, sparkling in the soft autumn sunlight, until he reached the Grands boulevards. As he entered a cafe, he took a seat, ordered a bark, and began to think about his next move. The situation created by M. Max's actions was unsettling. Trammell felt lost, truly a stranger in an unfamiliar place, tasked with an investigation among people whose language he didn't speak. He quickly realized that his mission would be impossible without local assistance. Thoughts of his own department crossed his mind. The excise had let him down. What about the Sûreté? But a brief reflection made it clear that he wouldn't be able to rely on them either. His appeal would hinge on the prospect of a future murder conspiracy charge, but he knew the evidence for that was too weak to present seriously. What was his next step? From what he could see, there was only one option. He needed to hire a private detective. This would solve the language barrier that had him completely stuck. Went to a call office and reached his superior at the yard on a long-distance line. His boss approved of the idea and recommended M. Jules Laroche, who lived on Rue du Samarad near the Sorbonne. Half an hour later, Trammell arrived at Laroche's residence. M. Laroche turned out to be a tall, unassuming man in his mid-40s, who had lived in London for some years and spoke English as fluently as Trammell. He listened calmly, showing little interest at first, but then agreed to take on the case. "We should leave for Bordeaux this evening to start fresh tomorrow," Trammell suggested. 2:00 at the d'Orsay station, Laroche replied. "We have just enough time. We can discuss our plans on the train." They arrived at St. Jean Station in Bordeaux at 10:35 that night and drove to the Hotel d'Espagne. They decided they couldn't do anything until the following evening when they would head to the clearing to see what they could find at the mill. The next morning, Laroche disappeared, claiming he had friends in town to visit, and it was nearly dinner time before he returned. "I've got some information that might help," he said as Trammell greeted him. "Even though I'm not part of the official force, I have some good connections, and we've worked together successfully. I know one of the local police officers, and he shared some details with me. It turns out that a M. Pierre Raymond is essentially the owner of Raymond Filth, the distillery you mentioned. He's about 30 years old and the son of one of the original founders. He used to be quite well off and lived in a nice villa in the suburbs. However, he's been living it up lately, and in the last 2 years he rented out his villa and bought a small house right next to the distillery where he's currently living. Rumor has it that he lost a lot of money at Monte Carlo, and it seems he's gotten himself into some trouble. People say he's strapped for cash now." "So you think he moved there so he could smuggle that brandy at night?" Trammell asked. "That's my theory," Laroche replied. "There's a motive behind it, too. He wouldn't have joined the syndicate unless he was in a tight spot. I suspect M. Pierre Raymond will be quite a fascinating character." Trammell nodded. That idea was worth looking into, and he felt fortunate to have such a competent colleague in Laroche. During the day, the Frenchman had rented a motorbike with a sidecar, and as dusk approached, the two men left their hotel and drove along the Bayonne road until they reached the Lesque. There, they concealed their vehicle behind some bushes, and reaching the end of the lane, turned down it. The trees loomed dark around them, and they struggled to stay on the path until they finally reached the clearing. There, a quarter moon cast a dim light over the area, and Trammell immediately recognized the scene from Gibbons and Bostick's descriptions. "Look, someone is inside the manager's house," he whispered, indicating a light glowing in the window. "If Henry has taken over Slatton's position, he might head down to the mill like Slatton used to. Shouldn't we wait and see what happens?" The Frenchman nodded in agreement, and they circled the edges of the clearing, just as Bostick had done about 7 weeks prior. As they crouched behind a cluster of bushes in front of the house, they might have found it intriguing to realize that it was from these same shrubs that lovesick dreamer had once watched his lady love, and from where he had seen her father make his secret trip to the mill. It was much colder tonight than during that previous watch of the isolated house. The two men shivered as they pulled their collars up around their necks, huddling to escape the biting wind. They settled in for a long wait, unable to even smoke for fear of being noticed. However, they didn't have to wait long. Around 10, the light in the window extinguished, and just 5 minutes later, they saw a man emerge from the side door and walk toward the mill. They couldn't see his face clearly, but Trammell guessed it was Henry. 20 minutes later, they watched him return, and soon everything fell silent again. "We should give him an hour to settle in," Trammell whispered. "If he looks outside, it wouldn't be wise for him to spot 2 detectives lingering around his cherished clearing." "How about we move in at 11?" Laroche suggested, and they agreed. Staying as concealed as possible among the bushes, they made their way toward the mill. Trammell had obtained a blueprint of the building from Bostick, and he approached the office door. His flexible wire worked just as well on French locks as it did on English ones, and in a few moments they were inside, with the door securely closed behind them. "All right," Trammell said, carefully directing the beam of his flashlight. "Let's check out those lorries first." As mentioned earlier, the garage was adjacent to the office, and by passing through the connecting door, the 2 men found 5 of the heavy vehicles inside. A quick glance at the number plates revealed that the digits were distinct from the rest of the lettering, displayed on small brass plates that slid vertically into place through slots in the main castings. However, the joint next to each number was not very noticeable, since similar vertical lines were cut into the brass between each letter of the entire inscription. "That's clever," Laroche remarked. "Make something less noticeable by making it complicated." Of the 5 lorries, 2 were loaded with firewood while 3 were empty. The men walked around, inspecting them with their flashlights. "Hey," Laroche suddenly called out in a low voice. "What do you see over there, Trammell?" The inspector moved over to where the other man was pointing at the granolithic floor. One of the empty lorries was parked close to the office wall, and Laroche stood between the 2. On the floor were 3 drops of some kind of liquid. "Do you smell that?" he asked. Trammell knelt down to get a whiff, then stood back up slowly. "Good catch," he said, his excitement rising. "It's definitely brandy." "Yes," Laroche replied. "Our nighttime visitor left behind a clue. This stuff must have come from this lorry, I suspect." They turned to inspect the vehicle more closely. For a while they didn't notice anything unusual, but eventually it revealed its secret. The deck was 2-tiered. Underneath, there was a hollow space about 6 feet long by 9 feet wide and at least 3 inches deep. And not only that. This empty space extended beneath the unusually large and wide driver's seat, with just a small compartment for petrol. In essence, the entire top of the vehicle was a huge secret tank. The men began measuring and calculating, quickly discovering that it could hold no less than 150 gallons of liquid. 150 gallons of brandy per trip, Trammell exclaimed. "Goodness, no wonder they make a profit." Next, they set about figuring out how the tank was filled and emptied, and eventually their efforts paid off. Behind the left rear wheel under the framework, they found a small hinged door about 6 inches square, secured by a spring activated by a fake rivet head. When they opened it, they saw a cavity containing a pipe connected to the tank, fitted with a stopcock and half of a union coupling. "The pipe that connects to this can't be far away," Laroche suggested. "We should look around for it." The most logical place was the wall of the office, which was only about 3 feet from the vehicle. It was finished with vertical tongue-end groove panels, and after a brief search, they found the loose board they were expecting. Hidden behind it was a pipe, jointed in a concertina fashion and leading to the other half of the union coupling. It was clear that the joints would allow the half coupling to be removed and connected to the one on the lorry, and the pipe ran down through the floor, showing that the lorry could be emptied by gravity. "Quite a clever scheme," Laroche remarked. "If I had seen that lorry 100 times, I would never have suspected there was a tank. It's well designed." They turned to examine the other vehicles. All 4 looked identical to the first, but they were exactly what they appeared to be, containing no hidden compartments. Bostick mentioned they had 6 lorries, Trammell noted. "I wonder where the 6th one is." "At the distillery, perhaps," the Frenchman replied. "Those drops suggest that fellow in charge has just finished unloading this one. I suspect he does this every night. If that's true, then Raymond must also unload a vehicle every night." "That makes sense. We can assume the task is completed nightly, since Bostick has seen Slatten come down here 3 nights in a row. He was definitely here to unload the truck. Exactly, and he probably arrived at 2 in the morning because of his daughter. That means there are 2 tank trucks, Trammell continued, focusing on his own thoughts. Hey, Laroche, let's mark this one so we can recognize it later. They made small scratches in the paint at each corner of the large vehicle. Then Trammell turned back to the office. I'd like to find that cellar while we're here, he said. We know there's a cellar because those customs officers saw the Girondin loaded from it. We should look around for the entrance. They began a search, similar to the one Trammell had conducted in the depot at Selden, but this time they discovered what they were searching for in much less time. In the office was a flat roll-top desk, accompanied by the usual set of drawers on either side of the central knee space. When Trammell discovered it was bolted to the floor, he felt he didn't need to look any further. On the ground at the knee space, jutting out towards the swivel chair in front, was a mat. Trammell lifted it and immediately noticed a seam in the floorboards where there shouldn't have been one. He fumbled, pressed, and pulled, and within a few minutes he was rewarded with the sight of the floor under the desk rising to reveal the top of a ladder descending into darkness. Here we are, he called softly to Laroche, who was searching on the other side of the room. The cellar they descended into was lined with timber much like the one at Selden. In fact, the 2 were nearly identical, except this one had only one exit, the passage under the wharf. It had a large tun, similar to the one at Selden, with a pipe leading down the passage under the wharf, coupled to a pump. The difference lay in how the pipes connected. At Selden, the pump brought the liquid from the wharf to the tun, while here it flowed from the tun to the wharf. The pipe from the garage came down from the ceiling and ran directly into the tun. The 2 men walked down the passage toward the river. The setup was the same as at Selden, and they paused only long enough for Trammell to show the Frenchman how the loading apparatus functioned. Well, Trammell said, as they made their way back to the office, that wasn't too bad for a single day. I suppose we've done all we can here. If we can gather as much information from that distillery, we'll soon have everything we need. Laroche gestured toward a chair. Have a seat for a moment, he suggested. I've been thinking about that plan we talked about on the train regarding searching the distillery at night, and I'm not fond of it. There are too many people around, and we're likely to be seen. It's not the same as working a location like this. True, Trammell replied, a bit irritably. I'm not keen on it either, but what choice do we have? I'll tell you what I would do. Laroche leaned forward, counting off his points on his fingers. That lorry was just unloaded. It's empty now, and if our theory is right, it will go to the distillery tomorrow, left there overnight to be filled again. Am I right? Trammell nodded impatiently, and Laroche continued. Now, clearly, no one can refill that tank without leaving fingerprints on the pipe connections in that secret box. If we clean those surfaces now, and come back here the night after tomorrow before the worker unloads, we could capture the fingerprints of the person who filled up at the distillery. Well, Trammell shot back, how would that help us? This way. Tomorrow you will become an English distiller, with a plot of forest available at a low cost near your operation. You plan to fuel your stills with wood fires. Naturally, you decide to check in on how M. Raymond manages his distillery, and you are shown around the facility. You have prepared a detailed proposal that you present to him when he is unable to set it down on a desk. He holds it between his fingers and thumb, eventually handing it back to you. Returning home, you use powder to capture his fingerprints for comparison. Trammell found the idea impressive. It was straightforward and promised to provide them with the information they needed without the need for a risky midnight visit to the distillery. Still, he wished he had come up with it himself. We might give it a shot, he conceded, lacking enthusiasm. It can't hurt much anyway. They headed back to the garage, lifted the secret lid beneath the truck, and cleaned the fittings with a cloth soaked in gasoline. After ensuring that nothing had been disturbed, they exited the shed, made their way back to the lane, and arrived in Bordeaux about 40 minutes later. Upon reflection, They decided it would be wiser for Laroche to visit the distillery, especially since Raymond might have gotten Trammell's description from Captain Beamish. The next morning, Laroche purchased a small notepad, and using an inner page that he carefully avoided touching with his hands, drew a cross-section of a wood-burning firebox, inspired by an illustration he had found in a reference book at the city library. He also studied the subject enough to discuss it without revealing his true intentions. After completing his preparations, he set off on his mission. A couple of hours later, he returned. "Got everything I needed," he announced as he rejoined the inspector. "I spoke to the guy, told him I was planning to start a distillery in the Ardennes where there's plenty of wood, and he was very accommodating. He showed me all around. There is a shed above the quiet furnaces, where hoppers allow the firewood to be lowered. Inside, I spotted the lorry, our lorry, marked on the corner. It was filled with firewood, and he explained it would be unloaded just before the day's shift left, allowing the stills to run overnight. I took a general look around the place, and noticed the large casks containing the finished brandy were right behind the wall of the shed where the lorry was parked. It became clear what was happening. Clearly, there's a pipe running through the wall, and Raymond comes down at night to fill the lorry. Did you manage to get his fingerprints? I've got them right here." Locking the door to their private room, Laroche pulled out the sketch he had made. "He held this up just fine," he continued, "so there should be some good prints." In the meantime, Trammell spread a newspaper across the table and retrieved a small bottle of powdered lampblack and a camel's hair brush from his suitcase. Placing the sketch on the newspaper, he carefully dusted some of the black powder over it, then blew off the excess. To their satisfaction, a clear impression of a left thumb appeared near the bottom left corner. "Now let's do the other side." Trammell flipped the paper and repeated the process on the back, revealing prints of a left forefinger and index finger. "Excellent, nice and clear," Trammell remarked. "Now I have something to share. While you were away, I gave this some thought, and I think I've come up with an idea." Laroche's interest was piqued, and Trammell continued slowly. "There are 2 lorries used for transporting brandy. Each night, one stays at the distillery while the other is at the clearing. One gets loaded while the other is unloaded, and every day they switch places. We can assume that neither lorry goes anywhere else in town, so the brandy tanks won't be discovered. For the same reason, it makes sense that they operate just one run each day. Am I right so far?" "I think so," Laroche replied, a bit cautious. "All right then. Let's say these 2 trucks are no's. 1 and 2 truck number 1 heads to the distillery every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, returning on the other days, while number 2 operates in reverse, making 1 trip each day, remember. This routine continues day after day, week after week, month after month. Now, it's not too far-fetched to think that eventually someone will notice this. Maybe a worker at the clearing or the distillery, a policeman on his beat, or a clerk at a window watching the route. And if someone does notice, wouldn't they be curious as to why these 2 trucks only go to that one location when the syndicate has 6 trucks in total operating in the town? If this observer shares their discovery with someone who can piece together the puzzle, it could raise suspicion, prompt an investigation, and soon the syndicate could be in big trouble. Do you see what I'm pointing out?" Laroche had been listening intently, and suddenly he gestured animatedly. "Of course," he exclaimed, his excitement evident. "The changing of the numbers." "The changing of the numbers," Trammell echoed. "At least, that's how it seems to me. Number 1 makes the Monday run to the distillery. They switch out the number plate, and number 4 does the run on Wednesday, while number 1 goes to another place where anyone interested can examine it freely. What do you think?" "You've got it. You've truly got it." Laroche was more enthusiastic than Trammell had ever seen him. "It's a clever scheme, right in line with the rest of their operations. They certainly didn't leave much to chance, did they? Yet it was this very caution that ultimately betrayed them." "True, but that was just an accident." "You can't," the Frenchman remarked with certainty, "make anything truly airtight." The following night they headed back to the clearing, and as soon as darkness fell, they entered the shed once more. With some more powder, this time white, they examined the tank lorry for fingerprints. As they had hoped, multiple prints appeared on the hidden mechanisms, including a distinct thumbprint on the rivet head of the spring. A brief inspection was all it took. The prints belonged to M. Pierre Raymond. Inspector Trammell felt once again that he should have been closer to solving his case, yet secondary thoughts made him realize he was still far from that goal. He had been trying to uncover accomplices in Slatton's murder, but ironically, instead of finding them, he had gradually unraveled the mystery of the Pit-Prop Syndicate. He had established, first, that they were smuggling brandy, and second, how they were doing it. For that, he would likely receive a reward, but that wasn't his objective. What he truly wanted was to resolve his case, earn the approval of his superiors, and move up in his career. And once again, he had fallen short. He deliberated over the matter for hours until suddenly a promising idea struck him. He considered it thoroughly and finally decided that, in the absence of a better option, he would give it a try. The next morning, the two men travelled to Paris, where Trammell bid farewell to his colleague and made his way to London, arriving at the yard an hour later to meet with his chief.